This is Anglia Television.
Britain's first and only ostrich farm, ahead in the sand operation? Not according to the Oxfordshire farmer running it. He insists it's a serious farm enterprise. Hello, later in the programme we have a report from that unique farm near Banbury. But we begin with the first of what we hope will become a regular feature on Farming Diary. We're pleased to welcome back Cambridgeshire farmer and journalist Oliver Walston to present the Walston Interview. And his subject this week is a man who's just taken on what some people would call the toughest job in farming.
Agriculture House, Knightsbridge, the headquarters of the National Farmers Union, which last week has inherited a new president. The occupant of the fourth floor corner office over there today is David Naish, an 1,100-acre Nottinghamshire farmer. He takes over at a time when even the Minister of Agriculture himself says the industry is in its worst crisis for 50 years. And there are some who say the union has a crisis of its own.
I have to say, Minister,
at last week's AGM, three distinct rumblings were audible amongst the faithful who assembled at Kensington Town Hall. One was the method by which David Naish became president, rubber stamped by the council, not elected by the 80,000 members. Another was the vague but persistent rumour of impending splits and breakaway groups. And the third, most ominous of all, was alarm and even anger at the leadership's enthusiasm for its latest policy, supply management. So where does the new president stand on these issues? Supply management, for instance.
The danger and the emotiveness that seems to have been created around those two words, supply management, is what's causing us problems. It's not the whole philosophy behind it, because the philosophy behind it was quite clear, was to find a method of equating the two. And yet the vast majority of people seem to believe that it means compulsory set-aside or quotas on everything. Those have never been the NFU's sole objectives. You know that when we went round the country in October and November, Simon and I, we always expressed the menu approach, the extensification, the method of extensification, possibly nitrogen as a route, more environmentally sensitive areas, set aside quite rightly. And we've always said what we must do is reduce the overall supply by one of these methods.
But come, David, that menu business is actually a total fudge.
No, not true.
Isn't it?
No, not true.
You're saying there are many, many possibilities. We in the NFU don't have the guts to choose any one of them, so we'll throw them all out as a possibility and hope that somehow we'll all agree. And in fact, you're not agreeing. The old Cereals Committee disagrees fundamentally and unanimously.
Well, let's just not unanimous, but let's just look what the Cereals Committee said in November. The Cereals Committee said, having looked at what the October Council decided, we believe that we would rather go down the route of price, a little bit more price. Please make things like set-aside, like environmentally sensitive areas, more attractive to us. I'm interpreting the Cereals Committee's views, but for the time being, we don't want to see compulsory set-aside. They then endorsed that position in January at the January Council, and then, of course, at the January meeting. And then at the January Council, between those two meetings, we'd had bounced on us the so-called McSharry proposals, which the Commission at that stage had approved, but the Council of Ministers hadn't looked at.
Now, we mustn't start talking about the Council of Ministers.
Yes, we must.
I'm asking you about the NFU, the fact that some people within the union, important people, Tony Pexton and his committee, say no, not perhaps, not maybe, but no to supply management.
But Oliver, you must recognise some timing that's come into this, and that's why I was going through the whole history. When we in Council looked at the October and January decisions of the Cereals Committee, we had on the table a whole new set of proposals from the Commission. Whether you say we should look at them or not, they're material to the debate at the moment, and those proposals were hugely discriminatory against British agriculture. So the NFU's philosophy at the moment, let's be quite clear about this, is that what we have to compete over in the next 3 months, and compete very carefully for UK agriculture, is the price proposals. The reform of the CAP has gone onto the back burner somewhat, because McSharry has said that he's going to come back with price proposals which allow him to live within the budget. Now, that might mean draconian cuts in cereal prices, which might be discriminatory, and if they are, surely you'd want us to defend
But I
them.
must bring you back to supply management, because many of your members, and I have to include myself as one, are confused. And therefore I have to put it to you. Are you as committed as Simon Gourlay was, totally, utterly and unalterably committed to the concept of supply management, or do you have reservations?
To the concept of supply management, I am totally committed. No fudge in that answer, however you describe it.
Right, good. Well, that's a nice, clear answer. Thank you. Next question, then. This menu system, whereby you could be nitrogen controls, it could be extensification, etc. If that menu does not work, and you are left with the realization that this side, the fuzzy side of supply management, doesn't work, so that only compulsory set-aside is the only option open to you, what then? Do you say compulsory set-aside?
I'm sorry, I can't have environmental aims called the fuzzy side of reducing supply management. Your words, not mine.
You choose the words and I shall agree with them.
I think that's extraordinarily important that we farm in an environmentally sensitive way.
No question about it.
I think that it's extraordinarily important that throughout Europe there's more attention paid to farming in an environmentally sensitive way. And if Brussels and the Council of Ministers can find a structure within which agriculture produces less product at the end, but farms more environmentally sensitive, I don't call that fuzzy.
All right. Therefore, I must again bring you back to the problem not just of supply management, but specifically compulsory set-aside, which, as you say, is but one option within supply management.
Right.
Question. Are you in favour of compulsory set-aside?
I'm in. David Naish of Naish Farms Limited does not want to compulsory set aside 1 acre, Oliver.
He may not want it, but is he,
but
as president?
He may have to do so if the price pressure or the carrot on the other side is so great that economically he does. And he also may have to do so if Europe as a whole is not prepared to reduce the supply of product so that everybody takes the same medicine. And that's the only reason that David Naish is committed to compulsory set-aside, is to make sure that British agriculture is not discriminated against within Europe.
But David, if you have supply management, if you have, I beg your pardon, if you have compulsory set-aside, one country and one country only will be discriminated against. It is the country with the large farms, and if I were a French farmer or a German farmer or better still a Greek farmer, and listen to you, the president of the NFU, saying you're in favour of compulsory set-aside under certain circumstances, I would open the champagne, because you'd be penalising the English farmers at the advantage of the Greeks and everybody else.
But Oliver, that's a lovely provocative statement. I mean, my whole concept has been, and the reason we looked at a menu approach to this, was that every country must reduce by a certain amount by some means. I mean, there's no way that you'll ever get a president of the NFU to say, I want to see the British farmer kicked and not his European counterpart. And I'm certainly not going to join that club.
But David, you're not naive. You must understand what you're saying. If you go in for compulsory set-aside, which only affects farms above a certain acreage, and you know perfectly well that most of those farms in this country are effectively doing exactly what you say you wouldn't do.
Can't I use my menu approach in the other countries as well? Can't I, in fact, say, OK, if the average farm size in Portugal is 5 hectares, 5 hectares, we're nearly about the same, OK, let's not argue, is that, yet we still want the gross agricultural product reducing by, whatever the number may be, 10%, why don't we extensify there by one means, let's say nitrogen or let's say stocking density, and why don't we take another route in other countries? Now, what I want to do is make sure that our ministers of agriculture, all 12 of them, are prepared to see a reduction in output in every country if, in fact, there is agreement that Europe should reduce its output. If, in fact, there is no agreement in GATT and in the longer term, we have to take a decision on how CAP is going to be reformed and how much the taxpayer will go on paying. And that, too, must surely be done on an equal basis, where there is equity between us and, in fact, no discrimination because of our farm size.
All right, so much for economics, so much for the wider perspectives. Let's come back home, back here to Agriculture House. You inherit a union which some people say is in crisis, and it clearly isn't totally at peace with itself today. Does this worry you?
I think, of course, were it to be true, of course it would worry me.
But it's not true?
I don't believe that it is in crisis, no. We actually have more full-time members at the end of last financial year for the NFU than we did the year before. an additional 3,000 full-time members. And I believe there are more farmers recognising today that if ever they needed an NFU to put the case of all British farmers together, they need it now. And I hope that we can get as many of them along that route as it's possible to do.
Well, I can see you hope that, and I wouldn't expect the President to hope anything else. But the fact still remains that you have a split between big farmers on the one hand,
Yes.
who think that the NFU is interested only in the small farmers, and the small farmers who think equally. You have the split, the normal old split between horn and corn, seen most clearly, by the way, in the Cereals Committee, which is totally and indomitably opposed to supply management. You have the
Opposed to
split about whether or not...
compulsory set-aside, not supply management.
All right, in deference to your understandable sensitivity, I promise not to mention the Cereals Committee again. However, I can mention the fact that people who live on the western side of the country and tend to have livestock feel differently from those who live on the eastern side and who are in favour of high grain prices. Big farmers feel differently to small farmers, and the gap widens. And more importantly, and possibly most significantly of all, there is a growing and vociferous movement within the National Farmers Union that feels that you're deserting the old constituency and selling out almost to consumers, to Greens, to people who are moving into the countryside, and you're no longer the fierce, single-minded defender of farmers. You're getting a little wishy-washy and, perish the thought, liberal in your old age. Is this true?
Well, I like the old age. As I take
Not
it.
you personally, I'm talking the union.
I hope that I'm growing into old age gracefully. In the days when government were asking us to produce more and more food, and it was only at the end of the 70s when we had Food from Our Own Resources and Agriculture in the Nation, both of which said we'd be starving by the year 1990, we obviously were a single-purpose body that were looking to make sure that we could produce that food economically. Our marketplace, which we've been talking about this afternoon, has widened now. It's widened not only to have that wide variety, secure supply of food, but a countryside which people want to see. Everybody is more environmentally conscious. And we must embrace, and I want to embrace, the wishes of the consumer of food, be they manufacturer or end consumer, and the consumer of the countryside. And where we can work together, it's certainly in our long-term interest, because their voice will then be a joint voice with ours, with government and in Europe. And you know, when you look at the approach that those people have to us, when they understand our problems, they are very, very good allies.
So this is the new consumer-oriented, green-oriented National Farmers Union speaking.
I wish you wouldn't try to differentiate. I was quite clear that
Didn't used to do this in the old days. In your uncle's day, nobody gave a damn about a consumer.
And now today, the consumer is king, because the consumer is the customer. I want the consumer to have what he wants from us, but I also want the facility, and my all-important role here is to make sure that I can earn a living providing what that consumer wants. I don't want to be at the end of social payments just for fun. I want to be doing it in a properly structured and constructive way to ensure the continuity and the backing of those people when we meet with governments.
But you see, you are changing. Changing, some people, myself included, would say for the better. When your uncle was president, I don't suppose in his 5 years, or however long he sat behind this desk, 13 years, I stand corrected. In 13 years, I bet you he never used the expression consumer once behind this desk.
But surely that shows what a healthy organisation the NFU is. I mean, any organisation, David Nash Farms or Oliver Woolston Farms, has to evolve and has to change with the demands and the circumstances of the marketplace. Do you mean to tell me you still only use 40 units of nitrogen on all of your farm, Oliver? Or have you accepted that the technology requires a high-protein wheat and more of it for you to survive? If the NFU wants to survive, it must properly represent farmers with their consumer, their customer. The customer is king.
Well, so much for the economic problems confronting us and the problems confronting the NFU. You wouldn't let me leave this room, I know, if I didn't ask you about one other thing. The fact that the Times, not a notably radical newspaper, has described your organisation as the last surviving example of Leninist democratic centralism in Europe because of the way you were elected.
I would guess, Oliver, that particular article must have given you a great deal of pleasure, having started this hair running many years ago, many months ago, as a belief of yours, and indeed there being direct quotes of Oliver Woolston in the Times article, which must have given you a bit of pleasure. I actually think that the democracy of NFU is as good now as it ever was. I believe...
Good enough, though? Good enough?
The way to test that is actually by asking what other organisation in 12 months' time will demand that its president gets 80% of the people voting for it for him to stay in office, even if no one stands in opposition. Now, could
Many people think that was a pretty cockeyed system too.
Well, maybe they would, but in fact, under those circumstances, it certainly means that you may question the democracy of the election of the NFU. I don't.
Well, I'll leave you now to get on with your work, but I'll leave you with one question, which I'd love to know the answer to. Are you happy?
Yeah, I am, actually. It's surprisingly, I think most people must think that I'm crazy to take on the job at this time. I actually am looking forward to trying to achieve something for my fellow farmers, and I thoroughly enjoy all that I'm doing.
A happy David Naish, and in case you didn't know it, his uncle was Jim Turner, later Lord Netherthorpe, president of the NFU from 1955 to 68. Now, by way of a contrast, ostriches. According to those who know about such things, ostrich meat is dark like beef steak, and its texture
9 millimetres of rainfall from a showery outbreak of rain. So although the front for most of its length was fairly weak as it crossed the region, it wasn't so along its entire length, and I think we'll see similar patchy outbreaks of rain coming along on any weather fronts that turn up in the week to come. The area to watch at the moment is the low to the west of Ireland. Now that is going to edge towards northwestern Scotland, so the centre of it and all its heavy rain is not coming our way, but it is going to bring the warm front back across the region late today and overnight after a fine day for most of us with that weak ridge of high pressure over the country. Now by tomorrow, the main low near northwestern Scotland will be developing quite a strength to the westerly wind, bringing the cold front down across the country during tomorrow, and I think it'll cross the region sometime during the second half of the day. Now, like the front early this morning, there is the chance that we could get some showery outbreaks of rain, which may well be somewhat heavier in places, although for much of its length that front is going to be another one of those fairly weak features. Notice the isobars indicating a fairly strong wind, but it is coming from the west, so relatively mild weather as well. The sequence for Tuesday, you can see another ridge of high pressure, a bit like today really. The next low developing in the Atlantic to bring the front back across the country, but again I think a fairly weak feature. Certainly the returning warm front will be, but on Wednesday the cold front will then come down across the region during, again, the latter part of the day to bring yet another spell where we could see some showery outbreaks of rain. On Thursday, things start to clear up again with the ridge of high pressure building once more, and once the winds become light and a bit more moisture around, we could find quite a bit of fog in the mornings, but not cold weather at all. That'll last through into Friday, the high pressure bringing a return of mainly dry weather. That's it from me. Have a good week's farming, and now, Farming Diary.
We're looking at about $15 for a fat lamb next year on a budget, and we're hoping it's going to be better than that.
Let's be clear, that's £5 English money for a fat lamb.
Yes, that's about right.
As opposed to 35, 40 pounds for somebody in the UK.
That'll be around about right, yes.
How much do you get for a litre of milk?
We're about 17 cents, 16 or 17 cents a litre in New Zealand.
That's about 5 pence, a little more than 5 pence a litre, quarter of what we get in the UK.
Right. We're what we'd call, we're on the bones of our backside at that sort of price.
New Zealand is fighting for its farming life. Its farmers live in a chilly, unprotected open market and receive the lowest prices in the Western world. Back in 1985, the New Zealand government abolished all subsidies. For 6 years, they've been trying to persuade the rest of the world to follow suit. So far, without success. Now the whole country's in trouble, because farming is the New Zealand economy. In the 1970s, New Zealanders enjoyed the second highest standard of living in the world. Today, they've fallen to about 15th. The cause of this decline may be rooted in the countryside, but the signs are visible in the city.
Incomes are at their lowest level for 30, 35 years in most sectors of agriculture in New Zealand. The outlook for us is exceedingly miserable. We will degenerate into a third world country. There'll be political instability. and the future for this as a country, as a nation, let alone its individual farmers, is exceedingly bleak.
Agriculture provides 54% of New Zealand's exports. Not surprisingly, the country is obsessed about the forthcoming GATT talks. Their success will affect every New Zealand family, but so will their failure.
The world, particularly in Europe, flatly refuses to act honourably and fairly and equitably in the area of trade in agricultural goods.
You sound angry.
I am angry. We are being threatened, our very livelihood as individuals, as farmers, and as a nation, by people who flatly refuse to come to the negotiating table and find a way through the dilemma that is provided by people who subsidise, who then go out and export their produce out there at a heavily subsidised rate and just absolutely demolish us in the marketplace.
New Zealand has a population of 3 million humans and 57 million sheep. The hills around Wanganui in the North Island are typical sheep country. Once you needed a horse to climb the steep tracks, but now farmers sit on a different sort of saddle. Trying not to think about the steep drop on my left, I was escorted to the summit by the brothers Donald and Alistair Poulsen, whose farm runs 14,000 sheep. Wow. That's some scenery. Amazing. How long have your parents been, or your family, been farming out here?
Nearly 100 years, or it's a little over 100 years, I think.
What would it have looked like when your great-great-grandfather, or whoever it was, came out here?
Well, if you look down that gully there and see the trees, I guess those trees would have gone to the top of the hills. So all this country's been cut out of bush.
Bush or trees?
Well, they're the same thing.
Now, about 6 years ago, the subsidies stopped here in New Zealand, and the pressure obviously came on. When it came on, what effect did it have on you as a farmer?
If you stand up here and listen, you don't hear much. Before that, you would hear a Fletcher, which is our top dressing planes, buzzing around just about 12 months of the year, putting fertiliser on. We would be, I think this year, one of 2 farmers that have put fertiliser on in our valley.
There's a couple of others, but there are a lot less than there should be.
So farmers have stopped using fertiliser?
Yeah. Well, it's a variable cost that you can stop, and what happens is that you've just got to drop back a couple of stock units and hope that you can maintain your pasture quality.
How close are you to getting to that stage where you say we won't buy fertiliser this year?
If we get the returns we're getting now, and it's probably some of the worst conditions we've had for farming for 30 years in New Zealand, we'll be unable to put fertiliser on.
How does the year 1991 look as if it's going to turn out for you, a New Zealand hill farmer?
It'll be the worst year in our farming career, by a long way. Here we are surviving with lamb prices that, by UK standards, you'd laugh at. You wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if we had lamb prices like ours. We are highly efficient with this sort of extensive system, but there's a point where it just cannot go on.
On extensive farms, labour is the biggest cost. In recent years, sheep farmers like the Poulsens have pioneered the so-called easy care system of lambing. In reality, this means no care at all. The ewes, mostly Romneys, are left on the hillside where they lamb on their own. Only at shearing time are the sheep ever handled after being mustered off the hills. The scene inside a wool shed can't have changed much in the last 50 years. Electric clippers may have speeded things up a bit, but the atmosphere is still the same mixture of noise, smell and movement it's always been. Shearing is one of the major costs of sheep production. Crutching in the spring is followed by the main wool crop later in the year. With wool prices half what they were last year and lamb prices also on the floor, I wondered what they've been able to do about their costs.
We've been able to trim some of those, I think, don't you? Because we now can talk turkey to the people that spread our fertiliser. The meat industry used to just add costs on because they knew that they could pass them on to us. And we've said, we're in the real market, we're in the real world, we're only getting a certain amount for a product. You can hold your costs, otherwise we won't produce any more lamb. And in fact, lamb numbers have dropped because of those sort of pressures. But the cost of killing a lamb, for instance, the last 6 years, I suppose, has stayed relatively constant, while other costs have gone up in other sectors of the economy. So the pressure comes on these people that service you. That's probably what I'm trying to say. Everything is designed to make a profit now, whereas perhaps before it was designed to produce the most. And to hell with the market end of it. And I think that's something everybody's attitude has changed. We're no longer producing the maximum amount of something. We're trying to think of what the market wants and produce to suit the market. It's not quantity and be damned anymore. It's trying to be realistic and make a profit out of what you're doing. It's a bit of a cliche, but we're leaner and hungrier than we ever were, I think. The fat's sort of disappearing out of the system.
One hour's drive through the green hills of the North Island brought me to another sheep farm in even more spectacular country. Derek Daniel, who just returned from a Nuffield scholarship studying sheep in Europe, took me to see his flock being mustered by a mounted shepherd and 6 noisy hunt-away dogs.
He sent a dog up into the right-hand corner there, and he's sweeping that face left, and they're going to go right down out of sight to the far corner of the paddock, and then they're heading off down to the wool shed. They're ewe hoggets, nearly a year old, and they're just going to be dagged prior to shearing in 3 weeks' time.
I was surprised to find him on a horse rather than on a motorbike.
Well, my problem here, I've got 3 young guys. If I buy an expensive motorbike, 4-wheeler for each one of them, it's quite an investment. And motorbikes can roll over cliffs and that sort of thing. Horses tend to look after themselves. And you tend to find that the person who likes riding horses tends to be a better stockman, and they move at the pace of the stock, not at the pace of the motorbike.
Derek Daniel is a ram breeder, and so is more protected from the harshness of the marketplace than other farmers. This perhaps explained why his farm looked so different from his neighbours.
This country in the foreground is my land and my sheep. Just the next fence line is a boundary, and the neighbour on the other side developed that land about 10, 11 years ago, and unfortunately has not been able to put fertiliser and the correct inputs in.
There's a totally clear line then between your land, which is green, and your neighbour's, which is, to put it politely, brown.
Yes, exactly. It's also partially bad management. The grazing has not been well done, but a lot of the lack of colour is just simply fertiliser. And once you start missing fertiliser, you start spiralling downwards in productivity, and soon you can't afford to put any fertiliser on. So some people have come to the realisation that fertiliser goes on before anything else. Once you start down that slippery slope, you're lost.
And from what Derek told me, quite a few New Zealand farmers had recently got lost. Their land is now reverting to scrub. But at least some farmers are still maintaining their inputs and, like Derek himself, are using helicopters to spray herbicides to keep the encroaching thistles and gorse at bay. At 35 pence an acre, it seems a modest investment. Even so, few can afford it. Land left untreated will be useless for sheep production within 5 years. Pessimists predict that huge areas of New Zealand will soon be out of livestock. Back on the farmhouse veranda over a cup of tea, Derek introduced me to one of his neighbours, Cedric Percy. How, I wondered, could these 2 men compete with the rest of the world?
The screws are on. If you look at the long-term trends, the prices for all agricultural commodities are going down and down. And we would have to admit that some of the unsubsidised agricultural production, like poultry and pig meat, have been able to improve their efficiencies of production, and they are very competitive with us. But it is difficult for us to try and compete with lambs at £35 subsidised farming. It's just about impossible now.
The positive side, of course, is that it's pushing every farmer in New Zealand to look very much at its cost structures and at marketing structures and to really sharpen up those acts. Whereas in the past, they've been fed by the subsidised life we've had. And now everyone is focusing on those very important areas that are eroding our net returns.
I think you've got to understand that livestock numbers have dropped quite dramatically in the last 7 years, from 87 million sheep equivalents to 74 million, drop of 15% in 7 years. We're doing our bit to help the reduction in production on the world market. But at the same time as we've been doing that, subsidised producers have been increasing their production.
How does that make you feel vis-a-vis UK producers, for example, your own kith and kin? Are you angry?
We're certainly not angry at the English farmers for the subsidies that they receive or the way they produce, because I think we see them as our kin on the other side of the world. But I think what we've done is experienced the damage that subsidies have done to us. And I think it's not only the effect it's had on our cost structures, but the reaction of the town people to farmers. During that period where farmers were seen publicly to be given a lot of money in any form, the public of the towns went against farming, and it was a very strong reaction. I think we're now being seen to be on a similar footing to town people, and the perspective of farming is starting to become real, and farmers are being respected again. And that's a very important factor.
In the good old days, before the common market had been invented, Sunday lunch meant New Zealand lamb, and a British breakfast wasn't complete without Anchor butter on the toast. But today, the world's a less cosy place. The price of lamb and butter is governed not by supply and demand, but by subsidies. While I was in New Zealand, a Russian ship was being loaded in the aptly named Bay of Plenty, with 4,700 tons of butter. In a British supermarket, this would sell for 65 pence a half pound. In New Zealand, the housewife pays 26 pence. But the Russians are buying the same butter for 8.5 pence per half pound. The trade war for butter grows ever more bitter.
Our problem is that the rich industrialised nations produce in excess of their own requirements, export them at whatever the world market price is, and the taxpayer picks up the difference. Now, no farmer, however efficient anywhere in the world, can compete against 320 million taxpayers in the community and another 250 million in North America and countries which are much more affluent than we are in New Zealand.
While the Dairy Board wages an unequal food war with the European community, milk producers struggle to stay in business. 20% of New Zealand herds are Jerseys, the rest black and white. The ratio used to be the other way round, but Rex Hines has stuck with his Jerseys.
We are very happy with our Jersey cows. They've done a good job for us since we've been in farm ownership, and it's a personal preference. I've always believed that there's good and bad cows in any breed, and you must enjoy the cow that you're milking. So
you just like them?
Yes, yes. They're a placid animal, easy to handle, and they suit this farming.
I was unhappy to notice that Rex Hines, like most New Zealand farmers, had docked the tails of his cattle. This, he explained, was to make life cleaner for the milkers. The parlour itself is big and basic. 2 men milk 24 cows on either side. No feed is given, although the cows received a molasses drench. Rex Hines gets a mere 5.5 pence per litre for his milk, compared to almost 20 pence in the UK. So perhaps it wasn't surprising that the philosophy on this and every New Zealand farm is keep it simple.
Everything we do on this farm, there has to be an absolute good reason for it. No money is spent unless we're going to get a return for it. Whereas one time, I think you set out and you spent money on farms because you like the look of what you were doing. But today, there's got to be an absolute reason for it. Currently, for this season, our costs will be cut to our expenditure will be cut to the bone, so that we can keep our cows milking and survive.
But now in Europe, when they brought in quotas, The average dairy farmer fed less concentrate and used more grass. You've already been doing this. You've never fed concentrate to start with. So how can you get more efficient than you are right now?
Well, our scientists are trying to grow better producing grasses so that we can produce more feed all year round. Because of our climatic conditions, we do have a feed deficit at certain times of the year. And concentrates is far too expensive to put into to fill that gap.
What about conserving grass? Do you make silage?
Yes, we
hay?
make silage, but with costs like they are today, there's a number of farmers within this area or within Deering going out of conservation because they can't afford the cost of contractors to come in and harvest that, or the machinery themselves to purchase.
Let me be clear about this. You're saying that the situation's getting so tight that some farmers cannot even afford to make silage.
That is correct.
While Rex Hines tightens his belt to survive, John Hopkins has done the opposite. An English immigrant who worked his way up through the traditional route of share milking, he's expanding his way out of trouble. With borrowed money, he's bought land and now milks 1,100 cows in 3 herds. But even here, the catalogue of cutbacks must make the local sales reps despair. Fertiliser, for instance.
We can't cut out fertiliser because we don't put any on, so we've already done that. On this particular farm, that's not general in New Zealand, but on this fertile flat farm that we farm on.
Herbicides?
We used to blanket spray our farm. We have actually cut that out this year, and we're just spraying the areas that are not easy to get at.
Concentrates?
Well, there's no concentrates other than the potatoes that we feed, which is an offshoot of our swapping with potato land. And our supplementary silage feeding.
Machinery?
In good times, we update our machinery, and when there's not the money there, we just farm it on. We just don't buy machinery. The only real avenue we've got is to increase production and be more efficient in that increased production, and by better genetic merit in our cows.
So you're actually saying the secret of the future for you is increased production in a world which is already awash with milk?
Well, it's increased production, but it's more efficient in that production.
A brave man, or a foolhardy one. Either way, John Hopkins is not alone. Some huge herds are being put together in New Zealand today by people gambling on successful GATT negotiations, which, they hope, will at last allow unsubsidized low-cost producers to export to the world. And in a perfect world, they'd be right. But the political realities dictated by the EC and North America will inevitably mean that New Zealand's voice will remain small on the world stage. And yet, this doesn't seem to deter the New Zealanders. Like early Christian martyrs, they seem to thrive on persecution, certain that they're right, not just economically, but morally. It came as a surprise to a pampered European like me that not a single New Zealand farmer I met wanted to return to a subsidised agriculture.
It's absolutely ridiculous for the fundamental mainstream economic activity in New Zealand to be subsidised by the nation. Not only is it economic nonsense, but of course it sends all the wrong signals to us. We've been through that, we tried it, we subsidised ourselves to the tune of 50% of our gross incomes for a period, and found that it not only wrecked our economy, but it also wrecked our on-farm operations when we started producing product that the marketplace didn't want and couldn't cope with.
So for a New Zealand farmer, there is life after subsidies?
Absolutely, no question about that. Even though it's exceedingly difficult to trade out there in the world, there is no way that New Zealand farmers are going to go back to a subsidised regime.
So I was on my way out to the post office when number 52, when I intended to be, walked in, cashing a postal order for the wedding conception. Oh.